I want to talk a little bit about what I have seen as a shift in my career. So I know we're looking to the future, but I think to be able to look to the future, we need to step back a little bit and look at the trends and the shifts. So I'm going to talk about engagement and the jargon word co-production. I'm going to say a little bit about the context and the shifting context, particularly the aspirations that people have as part of this, and then look at some of the techniques and approaches that we find, and my own practice as an approach is called place momentum, but I'll link to some others, because I have been fortunate to work with many different architects, engineers, transport, and even media and communication specialists in different stages of my career, and I suppose steal a lot of their techniques and approaches too. The key that I want to draw out is that there is something here about the changing role of professionals and people with knowledge, whether they might even be non-professional, but they're specialists, and wider communities. And we sometimes forget that those wider communities are also specialists themselves, be they doctors or lawyers or engineers or whatever they may be. They may know a lot about things. Just in terms of context, we sometimes have to be clear, if we're talking about planning or urban design, are we rebuilding something from scratch? Like this instance here in Freiburg, but I used to work for Edo, and we had a number of situations where we're rebuilding places that had been damaged for different reasons. Or are we building something completely new, greenfield, like a new town or an urban extension? Or, as many of us find ourselves, recreating a place, and this happens to be Glasgow, but it could be Malmo or any other place that's had heavy industry like shipbuilding before it. Or even small interventions of urban design or landscape design that change a place. And this example happens to be an industrial estate in Oslo. Some of what we do, I don't know, any engineers in the audience? Sometimes it's about engineering or re-engineering a place or infrastructure. Hands up those who consider themselves architects. You don't have to hold it, so yeah. Landscape architects? Great, yeah, you're very proud of that, yep. Planners, great, and people who, given we're talking about urban design, you think of yourselves as urban designers. Excellent, so we've got a good range, and I know I'm probably missed out the accountants and the lawyers in there who are very important. I want to check any media people, any journalists. You need to know if there's any journalists in the room. That's a key part of consultation. So it could be a whole range of different contexts, and one of them is time. That places change over time, and even in the short time I've been coming to Dublin, I've seen enormous changes. And some of those of you who've got much longer memories and have longer experiences will know huge changes. This is Glasgow. This is Buchanan Street, which not many people in the room will ever have visited Glasgow when Buchanan Street still had traffic, but you can see the stages of going from traffic to intervention to how it is today. Certainly when it's sunny. It's sometimes not quite like that if it's raining. But sometimes we're dealing with everyday basic things that we want to improve around the streetscape environments, trying to make it more convivial, sometimes even just for one day. That might be one Sunday a month where you have a different kind of access to an environment. So sometimes the interventions and the thinking about place that we're doing can be very small but have a huge effect. When we play that out over time, we can have a big effect. So who are we working for? What are we doing? What time frame are we doing the design work for? And if the plan is played through, what impact does it make on that neighborhood or that town? So look along the left. If we do this, our plan and the phases of the plan over one, in European terms, we'll call it mayoral cycle, 2 or 3 cycles, that has a huge impact on the place, cumulatively over time. A bit like I've experienced by revisiting Dublin and seeing things again. If politically, or our designs, different administration come in, they don't like it, they rip it up and they start again, they do something different in the streetscape or the buildings, and then someone else comes in and changes it again, we have stuff in the streetscape and the environment, but it's not necessarily cumulatively affecting the place and changing it. So to give you an example from London, probably Boris's bike scheme wouldn't have worked if Ken Livingstone hadn't already done the congestion charging in his period of office before, which reduced the amount of traffic, just as an example. Here's another problem we have sometimes as planners and designers, is we do a plan. but no one implements it. We got no resources, so we do another plan with maybe a more famous person associated with it. We don't have any resources and we can't agree on how to do it, so we need another plan. And you can see what's happening to the confidence of the place. So let's do another plan. If no one actually implements anything, you get plans that gather dust on shelves, often by very famous people, but they don't affect the quality of life of the place. Now, I know that's not like here, but my hometown of Aberdeen has been a little bit like that from time to time. So there is an issue as urban designers and urban strategists of thinking, who are we doing it for? Who are we representing? Who has the power? Who has the responsibility? I often joke that's outside the planning office, that sign, but it's not. I saw that in Gothenburg. But this one is real. This one I got in a hotel. And I thought this was appropriate to how we have to deal with placemaking and urban design in a whole range of different contexts. Everyone has baggage, and we all see things differently. From here, we might look at Wales and England like this. But where I come from in Glasgow, I tend to look at it like that. But it's exactly the same thing. It's the same place, we just see it in a different way. I want to explain how we approach our urban design and our urban strategies by taking this further with reference to Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but I've linked it to aspiration too. So a lot of the time we're dealing with people who either are or expect to become high-esteemed, self-actualized beings, often the well-off groups in any community. But we're often dealing on the ground when we talk to people with people who are not interested in urban design or in placemaking because they're struggling to keep a roof over their heads or have a job or look after their family, putting food on the table. And we're often trying to link the people, so we may not be dealing with people who can see things together from the same perspective, and we've got to help as mediators in the middle and help connect people to the same space, to the same territory, and share it. If I give you the example of this group who were coming to some of my consultation events where we were planning a major planned expansion of a town, they were coming to oppose it. So my view was to say, come in and join the discussion. Don't just stand outside with placards. This is for all of us to discuss. So what I'm alluding to before I get into some of the examples is that this philosophy of co-production, which our Place Momentum approach incorporates, represents a shift from old professional mystique knowledge, where the architect, the planner, the urban designer has all the knowledge and keeps it to themselves, a bit like a medieval guild. This is about sharing knowledge and making that knowledge accessible to the community, to the business community, to young people, and so on. Not only sharing our knowledge, but sharing the insights and the reflection and so on together. And that way the designer becomes an educator, giving power to local people and helping them articulate the problems. And sometimes, if you're the only one that can draw, you draw out the issues for them. What we're trying to do, as the next bullet point shows, is we're trying to build trust. And the trust is not only in the outcome, because people may or may not like the scheme or the drawing or the development at the end. We don't know. Everyone can't agree on everything. Often husbands and wives, sons and daughters and so on, they can't necessarily all agree. But they might agree that the process is fair and logical. So we're trying to build trust in the process as well as the outcomes. And therefore the techniques and the approaches we use become very key to that. Are we just communicating, telling people what they're going to get in a plan or a drawing or a scheme? Or are we actually seeking their views? Can we go further and actually engage them in the thinking, in the critique, in the ideas, contribution, and the evolution of the scheme, perhaps the selection of the options? And can we actually go further and empower them and actually help them make the decisions and maybe contribute much more to the design? So that's kind of some of the language of co-production we use, which some of you in the room, those of you who are planners and maybe geographers will recognize, is heavily borrowing from Shelley Arnstein's hierarchy of involvement and participation from the late 1960s. And if you don't know about that, have a read of it, because that's the base platform from which many of us draw. To lead us into some drawings and techniques, I just want to share this. What we're trying to do with our vocal acronym there is build a shared vision as broad as we can, so it's not just the planner or designers who have it. There is a broader sense of ownership, including perhaps from the business community, politicians, and so on. That increases the commitment to it when the planners, the designers, particularly if they're consultants who are dropping in and going on, the commitment locally to deliver it, make it happen, and often look after it. Look after the spaces, look after the concept, and look after the idea long term. So what we do is we engage with people early, before any vision's developed, during any option selection, in articulating and getting to a preferred vision, and then hopefully afterwards people become advocates themselves. Now, those of you who are involved in schemes and doing work, you might be working through from research and site analysis and data and design options and so on down the right-hand side, but the engagement with different players you see on the left requires different techniques as we move through the listening stage to the testing and reviewing to hopefully getting endorsement and buy-in and even advocacy. Where do we start? On site, on foot ideally, or occasionally we've done it by bike or even on water if it's a canal or a river. Get on site with people, go out and meet them in their in their local circumstances, in their local areas. Don't always expect them to come to you in a central place. You can see we're out there with what's called ice cream architecture, where we sell urban design from a van, and it works, and we still work with ice cream architecture on lots of projects, trying to get across age range. The danger for a lot of consultation and engagement is it gets a middle band of 55 to 75 age people, often retired or semi-retired, who represent one view, but often remembering life when they were a youngster, or even life as they imagined it when their grandparents were young. We need to get people who are also able to look to the future. The youngsters there were looking 50 years ahead in Glasgow, and they were discussing the needs for older people for a whole range of different reasons. So getting these kind of sectors thinking about place, about neighborhood, about security, and about quality of life, and getting into the process the issues that matter to them. And you might say, where does this fit with design? They're informing and communicating their intelligence into the brief. So we're not asking them always to become designers, we're asking them to tell us about things. And sometimes if they don't know about them, we share them. People start talking about things like green roofs or whatever it may be, SUD systems. We take them to visit them, see what they are, touch, feel, and not be afraid of them. Green roofs aren't necessarily something to be afraid of, and they're not necessarily just thin sedum strips. Where I live in Glasgow, it rains heavily all the time. We need something thicker. That's, by the way, on the top of the Academy in London, where Dick and I have been involved for the last decade or so. We take different people of different ages out on foot, looking at what's good and bad, getting them to think what their views are. So we're not telling them the answer or the design solution. We're inculcating in them a kind of curiosity and a judgment about what they think works and what doesn't. That last example is in Newtown in Scotland, but this one, I'm going to show you some canal examples where we've done a lot of our charrettes, where we get a whole range of people out looking at the neighbourhoods on either side of the canal. The canal's a big divide in the west side of Glasgow. This is, the tower is Glasgow University, where I teach, not necessarily in the tower, obviously in a crappy old building, but that's the interesting building. So on the canal, we tend to have charrettes because the government fund them. They have to be done between December and March. So it tends to be the weather is lousy. In this instance, we were having a whole range of events where we worked with artists on the charrette and the design thinking process, and we were pushing out, it was called What Floats Your Boat, and we were pushing our ideas out on the canal, on boats. Sadly, it was so cold the canal was frozen out and none of the ideas managed to float anywhere. But that's a different dimension. What people did manage to see is this wasn't just an urban area. There was wildlife here. I mean, there were deer, there were herons and so on. They hadn't appreciated in the middle of the city, less than a mile from the city centre, there is all this greenery and wildlife. They thought it was all going to be about housing and so on. So it meant the discussions that we had, and this is the crucial factor, is it's a shared discussion and it becomes a shared analysis of the issues and opportunities. It's not just your own view from your own house or your own business, worrying about your own particular problem. You're actually sharing ideas, and we shift gradually to opportunities. And you can see some of the perceptual stuff we tried to record early on. And the crucial thing here is a sense of responsibility. Those of you who are the designers may be holding the pen, but you're drawing on behalf of everyone. You're not just drawing on behalf of your own ideas, because you could probably go and generate an idea or a sketch or a design proposition on your kitchen table. You're actually trying to carry people with you and capture their concerns and their issues. And these are the kinds of things that come out. If you've got someone appropriate with a pen, and they may or may not be a designer, but they're trying to articulate the thoughts and aspirations that everyone has for that neighborhood. And this is a neighborhood either side of the canal. On the loop bit there is where Partick Thistle Stadium is, which is where we actually ran the charrette. So you can see some of the themes and thinking. So there isn't design yet, it's ideas and aspirations. Ultimately, that group ended up with that, which is much more boring, but it actually was the legal plan that they needed to produce as part of the supplementary guidance that becomes part of the local planning regime. Nearby, and these were for the council and Scottish Canals, we did another one, another charrette. If you haven't worked on a charrette or understood what a charrette is, it's probably a 3 to 5 day exercise where you condense maybe 3 to 6 months worth of work across disciplines by getting everybody together, local people, specialists, designers, engineers, people from the council or national agencies, and you work together intensively through the process. So the first sunny day we had in Glasgow that year, we got everyone out. And this was for the industrial area immediately to the north called Port Dundas. And the issue here is that the working together included role play because no one was living or working on most of the site anymore. So we had to think about what businesses, what residents, what visitors, what transport providers might be involved in the future and what do they need. So these people are working things through. In this instance, we used scenario planning. So we created different constructs, different drivers for future situations, including retail, learning environments, destinational environments for different kinds of visitors. And they developed scenarios, they discussed them, and they drew them. And we related them back to the present, almost to say, how do we take that forward and how does that relate to now? And there were different kinds of scenarios that we explored, and we looked at the common threads and we drew them together. So we had 4 or 5 sheets like this where people worked up basic ideas, and they included landmarks, landmark buildings, but particularly landmark structures, routes, connections, and a whole range of things depending on the scenario they explored. So they articulated a scenario from the future, drew it, and then we started putting all the scenarios together to think, is there a common structure we could make here? And this is a hill. The motorway, for those of you who know Glasgow, is immediately to the south. The writing, in fact, is over it. But the drawing of people's ideas and the progressive layering built in trust from the different participants. They could see it being done live. It wasn't being done in a back room, although to be fair to the team, they then had to go away and do some of that later. So this drawing live helped people understand what was being thought. It helped test things like heights of buildings, setbacks, and so on. They're semi-technical. They could see how that could move forward into proper technical drawings, but they were an exploration. We had long sections, cross sections, and so on as part of the exercise. What we then often had to have is that the designers do more work overnight to polish it up for exhibition the next day. And sometimes we would take 2 or 3 weeks to go away and do it on a computer as well, because we needed to produce documents that were going to become planning guidance, sometimes legally enforceable in supplementary guidance like the other one. So you could see how we get to that situation from the drawings like that earlier on. And that's where we are. We're going back out to consultation in the new year with some more of this. Those are some of the techniques, particularly in a charrette, where a lot of things are done very quickly, but you could do that same process over several months. There's something about inventing and shaping the future that those of you who are architects in particular might like doing with models. I normally say in these kind of situations, models are pretty scary when you come along with a model to a consultation, because it has the appearance of something that's fixed and finished, when actually the thinking within that may be pretty raw and underdeveloped. And when that happened at one of our drawings, it was a bit hairy because, of course, all the residents and everyone wanted to see how that affected their view. And with transparent blocks, it looked like all these buildings would be completely see-through. We presented this on October 2008, the month of the crash, as I recall, and as a result of the financial crash, this didn't get implemented in that form. And as you can see, it's not finished, and there's arguably shouldn't even be presented. However, we've looked at some where we mix layouts and provisional models and explore options within them. But I would normally say don't use models because it gives people a sense of things being fixed. But I'll come back to that in just a moment. We use instead a lot of the time now big sheets with plans of existing and sometimes future on them as a way you can see with exhibitions, it's not instead of, but we've worked recently with Jan Gale's office and others in Glasgow in the Sauchiehall Quarter, where to get a sense of the relationships and networks, having large plans that you can mark current issues and ideas for change, whether it's crossings, new buildings, small interventions like pop-up shops or whatever they might be, people can mark those on and share them. And they're very visible and they're very engaging. Well, they are normally. Here's one we did from a charrette recently, and I think this youngster wasn't quite so impressed. I want to come back to the models. I wouldn't have thought that in an age of high-tech, engaging, fly-through and all the rest of it that we have now, that actually there would be something in an old-style model. But I've got to tell you, I've just done a charrette here in St Albans. And it was in a very contentious site in the center of the city. And what we did is we had models that had costs per unit floor space. So construction costs and return based on the value of the use, be it housing or we had everything from entertainment, leisure, library, all sorts were in there, as well as offices and retail. And this is the whole community working on this for 4 days, site visit, we do all the things I've just talked about, but they built up options. And we actually explored not only the scale and the height, the uses, the public spaces, the trees were plotted. This had an economic cost and return implication that the community could discuss with the landowners and the developers. And the landowners and the developers came to this totally skeptical. Didn't necessarily want to be involved. The council thought, yes, the community are up for this, let's try the idea. And we got to a point where team members were able to draw proper schemes based on that and have some confidence that they could work. So what I'm suggesting is that even old technology and old toolkits can work because it's all about the trust factor. Now, I don't want you to think, I'm not suggesting we can't do 3D fly-throughs, or in this instance, we're using basic mapping to show options for a high street. This is in a small village of Tranent. And we show it in different ways. Like a lot of you in the room, we would show Photoshop. And the issue here is we're trying to discuss in this central high street through Tranent the possibilities of, they only have one street, and it takes all the traffic. It takes vehicle traffic, it takes buses, it takes cycles, and it takes all the pedestrian traffic. So we're trying to say is we've got to change the look and feel of it and slow the traffic right down. And it's very hard sometimes for people to see, all they can see is it's threatening, there's traffic. But we've got nowhere else in that town to put the traffic, really, having tested it all and modeled it. So we are looking at not quite a shared surface, but I think I call it slow flow. Slowing the traffic down, but it's allowed to go through in that kind of context. It is very hard to understand that, and I want to pick up, have any of you heard of Naked Streets? It's not a TV program. It's taking out a lot of the signing, the lights, all that kind of thing, and stripping out the streetscape. Here's an example. This one's from Ashford, and maybe some of the ones that if you want to study are the likes of New Road Brighton and Poynton too. One of the key advocates who I know has been in Ireland is Ben Hamilton Bailey. And Ben doesn't demonstrate this by computer. He goes out into the middle of the street, and he said, if you need to learn and trust how this works, this is what you do. Now, he doesn't encourage us all to do it, thankfully, but it works because he said the traffic is going so slowly that people can see each other eyeball to eyeball, and it's a different set of relationships than from vehicles rushing through. Now, there is a big contention. I've got him speaking next week in Dundee. The tension is with disability and visually impaired people in terms of how it works for them. But the idea is that you slow it down so much that the drivers even take account of people who've got problems walking. Just to draw this bit to a close, because I know you're going to want to talk about other things, is it's not all about development. Urban design and streetscape, and Dick talked about public realm and public environment at the beginning. It's also about the wiring of what happens. What happens in the spaces in the public realm and the semi-public realm that isn't simply about the buildings. Some of the urban design is about the animation and the activity. And I flag up the one more extreme version of Bristol from recently, where they put a slide down Park Street. Did anybody see this on the media and so on? It changed the nature of thinking about the city and this part of the city as part of the play and enjoyment experience. It wasn't just a traffic environment. So there was a huge queue. Not everyone could get to do this, but they did this temporarily, and I know other cities, I've been talking to cities in the US who are looking to do something similar. The issue is reprogramming the public space to think about it as a more enjoyable, convivial experience for all. This isn't just fun for the people shooting down the street on the slide. It's also fun for lots of other people watching and experiencing the town. And here's the man who was behind this. This is the mayor, or now former mayor, George Ferguson of Bristol. And his argument about urban design and urbanism was a lot of it is about dancing in the street. And he didn't just mean Martha and the Mandelas or Mick Jagger and David Bowie. He actually meant all of us. It's about how we use space and share it, and it's how we connect to each other in that space and have fun and experience it. And he had huge issues around access and parking and so on. But a lot of what came out of his mayoral period is that sense of sharing the street space. So I want to leave you with that idea that it's not simply about buildings, it's not simply a debate about design, it's also about how we relate to each other in the urban environment, sometimes in the village environment, and so on. The big shifts have been happening in our knowledge and awareness. We can all access all of this online in a mobile phone, which we couldn't 15 years ago. We certainly couldn't 50 years ago when courses started here. But also people's aspirations and expectations have shifted. Not only for the quality of environment they want to experience, but also how they want to be able to influence and comment on it. They don't want to be told what they're getting by a developer or by a council or whatever. There is also a lot more scope for innovation and interaction, both in the consultation process, but also giving feedback about whether people enjoyed that experience, whether that's on Facebook or Twitter or any one of the other techniques coming in. Therefore, for people like us, if we're working with communities or business, we've got more scope to give people influence and hopefully to have a meaningful impact. And the big question is it relevant, or are we just changing things and not having an impact on the outcome of place? So I leave you with this thought. It's about change and how we continue to change in the future, about empowering people, giving them an access and lever, but building trust in the system for all of them. Otherwise, we risk that this isn't a feature of public art. It's actually about us all getting too deeply set in our ways. Thanks very much.